Good evening, everybody. I'm Brigitte van Rijnberg, the Editor-in-Chief and History Editor at Princeton University Press. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to the third and final of Ian Buruma's three-part Princeton Stafford Little public lectures about the vast issue of religion and democracy on three continents, America, Asia, and Europe. These lectures are jointly sponsored by the Princeton Public Lecture Committee and Princeton University Press, who will publish them as a little book. The first week, Ian talked to us about the roots of American religion and made the point that there really are some close affinities between America and Europe. Last week, we learned about the founding emperor of Imperial China who loathed Confucianism and who tried to appropriate all forms of spiritual and mystical authority. We also learned about emperor worship and state Shinto in Japan. This evening's lecture is about Enlightenment values and tackles the vast issue of Islam in Europe. Tolerance, multiculturalism, and what role the state ought to play in all of this. In other words, the big question is how to accommodate different religious communities in Europe without excluding them as democratic citizens. And appropriately, tonight we have Harold James introducing Ian Buruma. Harold James is a professor of history at Princeton University as well as professor of international affairs at the university's Woodrow Wilson School, and also the director of the program in contemporary European politics and society. He specializes in economic and financial history as well as modern German history, and his books include, among many others, A German Identity, International Monetary Corporations Since Bretton Woods, The End of Globalization, Lessons from the Great Depression, as well as, most recently, The Roman Predicament, How the Rules of International Order Create the Politics of Empire, which he published in 2006 with Princeton University Press. Okay, Harold.
Thank you, Brigitte. I'm very pleased to have been an author in Princeton University Press, and I'm also very, very glad that my old friend Ian Buruma is going to be an author in Princeton University Press with the publication of the splendid lecture series that we're halfway through, or just over halfway through. You've heard already, I think, very much about the amazing range of Ian Buruma's work, that he's written so much about European affairs, but also about Japanese affairs, about Chinese affairs. He's looked at the relationship of the Japanese and the Germans with their past in a comparative way. He speaks an amazing number of languages. He ranges across the continents, at least in the northern part of the world. But today, I think what makes Ian special is something that he really doesn't have much credit in. That is that he was born in a very interesting place, and he grew up in a very interesting place. He was born in the Netherlands, and some of his recent work has been a reflection of the peculiarities and the particular challenges that the Netherlands face in the context of a very rapidly changing Europe. And the Netherlands are, I think, of great importance because we think of the Netherlands as the home of religious toleration, that this is a place where toleration as a principle came into being when most of Europe was still fighting religious wars. If you go into Old Amsterdam, you can find a Catholic church behind the walls of an ordinary house. It's supposed to be a secret and covert church, but it was so big that it's difficult to believe that people in the 17th century weren't aware of its existence. So this was a country and a place of great toleration. And one of Ian's most interesting books, among the 13 other books that have been described already in introductions in the course of this series of lectures. The most applicable book for the purpose of this discussion, I think, is the book that he published in 2006 with the title Murder in Amsterdam, The Death of Theo van Gogh and the Limits of Tolerance. And this book really raises exactly this question: what are the limits of tolerance? Because he looks in a way that I think upsets some people at the people who tried to put forward one particular view of toleration and then found themselves, as a consequence of putting forward that view of toleration, of being massively intolerant. The maverick political leader, Pim Fortuyn, a liberal, an advocate of gay rights, who then found that the presence of large numbers of Muslim immigrants was unsettling in a profound way the society that Fortuyn thought that he wanted to live in. Or the film director, Theo van Gogh, who was radically contemptuous of many forms of religious practice, and thought that a vision of toleration should embrace that kind of universal contemptuousness, whether it was for the Jewish tradition or the Christian tradition, or also for the Islamic tradition. So, looking back on this, I think the sense of the title is that one should go back to the discussion of faith and reason that Ian was talking about last time from the world of the 18th century Enlightenment. But I don't really know what he's going to say. That's actually his job to tell you what Enlightenment values are. The title of this evening's lecture, Enlightenment Values. Thank you very much, Ian.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. It's the first time I've ever been praised for being raised in Holland and hearing it being praised as such an interesting country. It didn't feel like that when I grew up. I spent most of my childhood thinking of ways to get out of there. But it's true that in recent years it's suddenly become interesting. Not necessarily for all the right reasons, but it has become more interesting. One of my great idols, Heinrich Heine, famously said that if the end of the world is to come, you'd better move to Holland because everything happens there 50 years later. This is no longer quite true, but it felt like that when I grew up there a little bit, especially in The Hague. Things happened in Amsterdam, but not really in The Hague. One of the figures that runs through all three lectures as a kind of guide is Alexis de Tocqueville, and I thought I'd start the third and final lecture with him as well. Among other subjects, he had something to say about Islam, and I'll quote him. He said, Muhammad, and here I quote Tocqueville, brought down from heaven and put into the Quran not religious doctrines only, but political maxims, criminal and civil laws, and scientific theories. The Gospels, on the other hand, deal only with the general relations between man and God and man and man. Beyond that, they teach nothing and do not oblige people to believe anything. That alone, among 1,000 reasons, is enough to show that Islam will not be able to hold its power long in ages of enlightenment and democracy, while Christianity is destined to reign in such ages as in all others. I think I have this quote from Professor Israel's great book on the Enlightenment, and I've learnt a lot in all three lectures, in fact, from his work. And one of the other things that he describes in his book is how not all thinkers of the Enlightenment agreed with this assessment. In fact, Spinozists, such as Pierre Bayle, thought that Islam was more tolerant than Christianity and less superstitious. And also it was remembered that Islamic scholars, or at least Arabic scholars, were the ones to carry on the Greek classical tradition and bestow it on European civilization when Europeans themselves had largely forgotten about it. Ibn Rushd Averroes, the famous philosopher, Islamic philosopher, was compared to Spinoza, as well as Confucius, as we saw in my talk last week. is it really true that Islam is not compatible with democracy or Enlightenment values or any kind of liberalism? Well, I think it's an open question, but one should assertions that to that effect, I think, should be regarded with some skepticism. If you look at the Islamic world today, it is certainly true that, especially in Arab countries, liberalism and democracy is having a very hard time. But one should also remember that most Arab countries, in fact perhaps all Arab countries, are ruled by secular authoritarian regimes, police states even, and not religious ones. The only country that has an Islamist, an overtly religious form of government is Iran, not an Arab country. And in Southeast Asia, one of the most interesting phenomena, largely unremarked in the Western press, I think, is that the two countries that have the best chance at the moment of becoming quite lively democracies are also majority Muslim countries, and Indonesia in the first place, and Malaysia possibly. Malaysia still has some problems, but it's struggling with democracy, and in some ways in a more hopeful manner than many other countries in Southeast Asia. So I think it's highly doubtful that Islam per se is incompatible with democracy or liberalism, even though there are clearly political problems in the Islamic world. It is true that there is a violent revolutionary movement that has emerged from the Islamic world that is a serious problem. There's no question about that. But I think it's dangerous to conflate, as some people do, the problems of radical Islamism, that is political Islam, with other aspects of the Muslim religion, which are seen, sometimes rightly, as less than liberal, as incompatible with what people regard as Enlightenment values, which are then often conflated with Western values. The Enlightenment has become part of a political debate, which I think is a fairly recent phenomenon. Before, not so long ago, the Enlightenment was something that scholars talked about, historians talked about, philosophers talked about. It was not something one came across in newspaper columns very often. One still doesn't come across it very often in American newspaper columns. In Europe, it's now become very common currency. And people talk about the Enlightenment all the time as something that has to be defended against its enemies, against what people call Islamofascism and so on. And it's often, I think, used very loosely, and something that people rarely mean by that Western values, without really defining very carefully what those Western values are supposed to be. I think, for example, that many people who now talk about Enlightenment values in the sense of Western values 20 or 30 years ago probably would have talked about Christian values. And in America, this can still be done relatively seriously, at least in some circles. In Europe, you can't really do this respectably anymore. It's become too secular. But so I think that when people now talk about Western values, since they can't talk in terms of Christendom anymore, they use the Enlightenment as a kind of shorthand for what they mean by European values, Western values, that has to be defended against its purported enemies. And I think that same way of thinking, that the Enlightenment is being threatened by a non-enlightened, by a non-Western enemy, merges with the idea of the clash of civilizations, that what we're dealing with is one civilization, the Western one, the enlightened one, the open one, with a non-Western civilization which is associated with Islam. And I think this is a great error in thinking, because the problem of radical Islamism, of extreme political Islam, is real enough. But I don't think it can be adequately explained by talking about a clash of civilizations, certainly not in the European context. Now, why do I think that? If you think of the patterns of immigration in recent decades in Europe, it's not the original immigrants, the Gastarbeiter, the people who were imported from countries like Morocco and Turkey to Western European countries to do jobs that Western Europeans themselves no longer wanted to do, cleaning out trains, sweeping streets, working in factories, and so on. These original guest workers are not the radicals or the political extremists or the revolutionaries. They were people from villages who did indeed come from a different civilization. They had a village culture, and their religious practices reflected the culture that they came from, but they were in no way revolutionary, radical, or violent. Their main role in life was to do backbreaking work, send enough money home that their families could survive, and so on. The radicalism that does exist in Europe now, and is indeed a serious issue, but really only emerged with the first and second generation of immigrants who were born and bred in Europe and have been attracted to more or less radical forms of Islam, Islamic fundamentalism, and sometimes violent revolutionary Islam. Now, the question is why? Why would somebody who is born in the Midlands in Britain or in the outskirts of Amsterdam, why would they be attracted to Islamic fundamentalism or an Islamist political ideology? A good example of this kind of phenomenon is the leader of the so-called London bombers who tried to blow up the London Underground and killed a large number of people, Mohammed Siddiqui Khan. And he was the ringleader of the so-called 7/7 bomb attack on the London Underground. He was born in Leeds, in the north of England, in 1974. And he grew up in Beeston, which is a run-down suburb, very bleak, with a large immigrant population, many of whom came from one tribal area of Pakistan. It was beset by the usual problems of poor immigrant areas, a lot of drug addiction, crime, and so on, and poor. And a group of young men decided to do something about this and formed a group to improve social conditions there. And they were known as the Mullah Boys. And their goal was to combat crime and drug addiction. And were largely applauded for this by older people, except that the older people were worried about one thing, which was their attraction to a type of militant Islam that the parents of these people certainly did not espouse. And it was Wahhabism exported by Saudi Arabia, financed by Saudi Arabian sources, and so on. Now, Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, known as Sid, to his school friends, was not a natural hater. He had white friends and was full of ideas on how to better the lot of his communities. And he studied at Leeds Metropolitan University. He met his future wife there, a Muslim of Indian origin who did not come from the same tribal group that he did, which already caused conflict with his parents. He became an active member of the Mullah Boys, and that's when he was attracted to Wahhabism. Now, why Wahhabism? One of the reasons was that the religion, the kind of Islam that his parents had brought with them from their village, was propagated in a language that Sid no longer understood. They spoke Urdu. Sid only spoke English. He was, after all, he was a Brit. And one of the strengths of Wahhabism is that it's propagated on the internet and other places in English. It's an international form of fundamentalism that is not rooted in a particular culture or village culture such as that of his parents, which is one of the main reasons why it attracts a lot of young people who are born and bred in Europe and feel alienated both from the village culture of their parents and the society in which they were born and grew up. I think that's the main attraction of it. And the Urdu speaking preachers of Sid's parents' generation certainly didn't appeal. I mean, they were from a culture that was strange to this Yorkshire lad. And of course, in its political form, fundamentalist Islam, when it becomes politicized, is an ideology, perhaps even more than a religious faith, let alone a tradition, and therefore appeals to young people who are looking for a cause for which to sacrifice themselves and possibly kill other people as well. It's a revolutionary ideology that I would argue appeals for social and political reasons more than theological ones. It gives people an identity in circumstances in which they feel that their identity is very shaky, that they don't really feel that they belong to anything very much. It gives people a meaning to their life. It gives people a reason to live and so on and so forth. And in this way, Mohammed Siddiqui Khan is not at all unusual. The killer of Theo van Gogh, about whom I wrote this book, Murder in Amsterdam, is very much like Mohammed Siddiqui Khan. Mohammed Bouyeri, his name, who grew up in a suburb of Amsterdam, in many ways as a typical Dutch kid who liked football and drinking beer and chasing girls and so on. But he felt certainly alienated from the Moroccan village culture of his father, but equally ill at ease and perhaps oversensitive, as many first-generation immigrants are, in the society he grew up in. Various things in his life went wrong, and rejections from girlfriends, his beloved mother died, and so on. He needed something to give him a sense of power, a sense even that could satisfy a rage that was building up in him. That he felt that he was a loser in this world, and he wanted to take his revenge on the world. And a purist form, an ideological form of Islam was exactly what he needed to do this. Conrad, I think, Joseph Conrad described this phenomenon much better than anybody who tries to explain this phenomenon by explaining the Quran, for example. I think you get much closer to understanding the psychology of a Mohammed Siddiqui Khan or a Mohammed Bouyeri by reading Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes than you do reading Karen Armstrong's book on Islam, which is not to cast aspersions on Karen Armstrong, who may be fine on that subject, but I just don't think it's as enlightening as Conrad, who described exactly that kind of figure, the vulnerable, the young man with a ticking time bomb in his pocket, walking around London, anonymous in the London crowds, who wants to have his revenge on the world that has let him down, where he feels that he has not found his place, and wants to drag himself down out of self-hatred, but also wants to drag the world down with him. I think that, in many ways, is what explains these Islamist killers, as well as, let's say, the anarchists in the early 20th century. What they needed, in the case of Mohammed Bouyeri and Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, was a peculiar vision of Islam to justify their acts of violence, their acts of vengeance against the world. Now, the debate that's emerged from these tensions in Europe, which has been described by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas as a Kulturkampf, a cultural war between the so-called secularists and the so-called multiculturalists, is interesting, and at the moment it's slightly overshadowed perhaps by the economic crisis, which has led some to believe that the debate is over. I'm not at all sure this is true. I think it is still going on and will come and go for quite a while. Now, when you look at this Kulturkampf, the main enemies of the secularists, when they attack Islamofascism, as they call it, and I'll come back to the reasons why they call it that, is not so much the Muslims themselves, although, of course, they are the prime target, but it's also multiculturalism, or what is sometimes called moral relativism. Now, why did multiculturalism become so powerful ideologically in countries such as the Netherlands and Britain? There are several reasons, mostly to do with recent history. Two historical reasons, I think, are the most important. One is the colonial history, which has left a strong sense of guilt, especially amongst what was still a powerful left in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And the idea that imposing or even asserting Western civilization, Western values, including the Enlightenment, on non-Western people was a form of neo-imperialism, even neo-colonialism. That non-Western cultures were superior to Western culture. Indeed, that the very idea that the Enlightenment was a universal value that all should be encouraged to take part in was a form of neo-imperialism, and that it was the ideology of multiculturalism is that it was not the cultural difference. People who were living and were born in Europe, who came from non-Western cultural backgrounds, that not only needed to be celebrated, but actually needed to be encouraged and inserted, and that people needed to be told to stick to their own culture, and that any notion of integration, let alone assimilation, was a form of colonialism, was a throwback to the past. Another explanation for this, I think Gilles Capel, the French scholar of Islam, has made this point, is that actually that kind of multiculturalism is a reflection of the way that the colonial empires were run in the past. The British, under the British Raj, people of different religions, different communities were dealt with as communities and encouraged to stick with their communities, and were not dealt with as individuals. And there may be some truth to that. In the case of the Netherlands, the Catholics and the Protestants, I talked about that in my first lecture, there were such tensions between the Christian communities that a de facto kind of multiculturalism actually has a longer tradition in Holland too, going back to at least to the early 19th century, when the different communities lived in their very segregated worlds known as pillars, in which, from cradle to grave, you belonged to associations and institutions that were associated with your religious beliefs. And so that the modern form of multiculturalism in some ways is a reflection of that. And there may be some truth to this too. The other historical event, of course, that hangs as a shadow over all current debates on minorities, on non-Western cultures in Europe, is World War II, and specifically the Holocaust. And this is a particularly painful memory in the Netherlands, where a larger percentage of Jews were deported than anywhere else in Europe except Poland. Now, there are more than 70% of Dutch Jews were deported to the East, and most of whom never came back. And there are many possible explanations for this. The least plausible is that the Dutch were more anti-Semitic than any other Europeans. If anything, the opposite is true. But nonetheless, it happened. And this, since the 1960s, before the 1960s, it wasn't discussed very much at all, but since the 1960s, this has certainly been a very sore point, and is always there in the background of debates on minorities. And I think it's led, on the one hand, to, you find it on all sides of the debate. People on the multiculturalist side use it as against those who assert the notion that immigrants, minorities, should integrate, assimilate to the majority culture. They are accused of racism, of introducing the same or exemplifying the same bigotry that in the past led to Nazi persecution, which kills any kind of serious debate on how to deal with immigrants, whether one agrees with the integrationists or not. And on the other side, you find people who are constantly reaching for comparisons with World War II or with the 1930s and use words like collaborator, appeaser, and so on for those who would seek some kind of accommodation with Islam in Europe. The year 1938 is very frequently invoked by those who are warning us against the dangers of Islamofascism. One American writer writing about Europe and very much a warner against Islamofascism talked about Europe's Weimar moment, as though Islamofascism is the modern incarnation of Hitler's Third Reich, and anybody who seeks some kind of accommodation with Muslims in Europe, who seeks to find some place for Muslims in public life in Europe, is acting in the tradition of Chamberlain and is really an appeaser with an imminent danger. The tone of this debate has become very strident and has divides people. It's become so polarized that it divides people into friends and enemies in a way that makes rational debate of people of different persuasions trying through their differences, their differences of opinion to find some kind of truth is rather buried under all this. And one of the interesting things is that people who were on the left, who were great defenders of multiculturalism in the 60s and 70s, have very often now joined those on the right, the neoconservatives and others, in their fervor against what is seen as the Islamic threat. And I think one of the crucial events that led to this situation, that drove part of what used to be the left into the right, was the Salman Rushdie affair, the affair of the publication of the Satanic Verses. Salman Rushdie was himself, of course, was very much a man of the metropolitan left, very quick to denounce people in the West of neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism, a defender of multiculturalism and non-Western cultures and so on. And what was such a shock, I think, to him and his defenders, that when his book was burnt, it was burnt by non-Western citizens of the United Kingdom. He was very much part of the metropolitan elite. Suddenly it was one of us, so to speak, who was the target of a non-Western rage. And many people who before that were always inclined to defend any non-Western protest against the West now took Salman Rushdie's side in name of, at best, free speech, which was as it should have been, which was right. I mean, I myself did that too. But in some cases it led to an overreaction, I think, and people switching sides and like in the manner of converts, defending the opposite view from one that they had before with equal zeal. Pim Fortuyn has already been mentioned in the introduction. I think he's one of the most interesting politicians to have come out of this debate and this sense of crisis in Europe. Because although Pim Fortuyn was a populist in Holland, by the way, he was murdered, assassinated, not by a Muslim radical, but by a radical vegan. Thank God, because if it had been a radical Muslim, it would have probably been a lot worse. But Pim Fortuyn is an interesting figure because although he fits into a typical figure of the European populist right wing in some ways, for example, the way that he exploited fears that are very widespread of a loss of identity in a globalizing world. He promised a way back to a cozier sense of national identity that vaguely of the 1950s, when the Netherlands was white and people understood one another and there weren't all these people amongst us cooking strange dishes and worshipping strange religions and so on. On the other hand, he was very different from the typical right-wing European populist, such as Jean-Marie Le Pen in France or the late Jörg Haider in Austria, in that his main attack on the Muslims and on Muslim immigration in the Netherlands was precisely that the social changes achieved through the student protests and the social revolts of the 1960s were now suddenly in danger. He himself had been a man of the left. He came from the Socialist Party originally. He was not only openly but flamboyantly gay. Once when somebody said, "What have you got against Muslims?" he said, "Me against Muslims? I sleep with Muslims." Not something Jean-Marie Le Pen would have said, or not even Jörg Haider, whatever his private practices may have been. So he was unusual in that sense, and I think he was popular with people who had been on the left, who had been rebels in the 60s and 70s, including Theo van Gogh, who wrote many of his speeches. They were quite close, Theo van Gogh and Pim Fortuyn, partly because they liked the sort of each other's irreverence, but partly because there was a genuine sympathy, and the sympathy was based on the fact that, on the feeling that the younger generation of leftists and liberals in the 60s, like in America, had fought for all these social changes of gender equality, of sexual equality, and so on. And here were these Muslims, these immigrants, endangering all those social achievements all over again. As Pim Fortuyn himself said, "I don't feel like having to go through the emancipation of women and homosexuals all over again." A sentiment that was understandable and in some ways appealing. But the rage over these things, I think, has added that, and the fact that many people who had been Trotskyists and leftists of one kind or another, I think explains the rather strident tone of the debate, of the Kulturkampf, in Habermas's words, that is taking place in Europe at the moment. The kind of debate that is dividing people into friends and enemies. Another iconic figure of this debate in the Netherlands is somebody who's become quite well known in the United States because of her autobiography, is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And she's a genuinely interesting and in many ways admirable person. For those who haven't read her book, she was born in Somalia. Her father was a liberal politician who spent a lot of his time in jail when she was a child. They had to, because of her father's politics, they had to live in Saudi Arabia and then Kenya, where she was largely educated. When she was a teenager, almost as a kind of rebellion against her parents, who were not religious radicals, she became a rather strident Islamist, dressed in hijab, and she protested. She was one of those people who wished Salman Rushdie dead when he published his book, and so on. Then her father, who was a political liberal, but not necessarily, like many political liberals, not particularly liberal when it came to his own family, and insisted that she marry a relative who lived in Canada. And on her way to Canada, she stopped in Germany, and she decided she couldn't go on with this, and fled to Holland. Now, in Holland, she learnt Dutch very quickly, studied political science, and was converted to atheism. And again, people who convert from one thing to another often do this with a certain amount of zeal. Now, she played a very important part in the Dutch debate. In fact, I think a very useful part, in that she drew people's attention to the oppression of women in immigrant communities, and particularly in Islamic communities, women who are oppressed in the name of Islam. Now, Islam itself may not necessarily have been the main reason for their oppression. The oppression often had to do with cultural traditions that were in the background of these immigrants. Nonetheless, there is a lot of abuse of women in immigrant communities, and she played a crucial role in drawing people's attention to it. Where I disagree with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and where she's also been quite influential, is in her view that Islamist extremism, the extremism of political Islam, is inherent in the faith itself. As she put it about 9/11, she said it was not just to do with the revolutionary violence, was not just to do with Islam. It was, I quote, the core of Islam. And the inhuman act of those 19 hijackers was its logical outcome. Now, I think this is dangerous, because if we say that, then we do have to think in terms of a war, a clash of civilizations, and deportation and violent suppression is the only answer. It also, I think, exacerbates this sense in which of the Kulturkampf, in which you can only be a friend and an enemy. The idea, namely, that the source of revolutionary violence is not political, it is theological. And the other way in which she's been, I think, a rather polarizing figure is that it's allowed people to grandstand on her behalf, often for rather chauvinistic reasons. It's American neocons can claim that she came to America and that proves that America really is the land of the free and the brave, whereas those namby-pamby Europeans are doing what they've done and always done in recent history. They're appeasers and collaborators and so on, and it takes the Americans to defend what's left of Western freedoms. It's allowed the French to, when the Dutch government, not with a great deal of tact, it must be said, but decided that they were no longer going to pay for her security when she became a permanent resident of the United States. It allowed the French to claim that France was the country of liberty, fraternity, and equality, and if only she became a French citizen, she would be guaranteed the protection of the French state, something that the French Foreign Ministry had to withdraw very quickly after these great statements were made. Nonetheless, it's led to a great deal of hyperbole, which in my view does not help us in the debate that is a serious debate on how to deal with the presence of a large number of Muslims in Europe. The kind of statement made, again, by Salman Rushdie himself, in an op-ed piece in which he called Ayaan Hirsi Ali the first European refugee since the Holocaust. I don't think this is helpful. There is no room, if one thinks in terms of a Kulturkampf, for tolerance. Indeed, the word tolerance recently has become a dirty word in some circles. When the Queen of Holland, Queen Beatrix, in her Christmas speech of 2007 pleaded for more tolerance and pluralism in Dutch society, she was denounced by some of the more radical participants in the Kulturkampf. One right-wing populist Dutch politician said the word tolerance in her speech made him vomit. Now, there is a serious aspect to this debate. I myself have been criticized for, quote-unquote, tolerating intolerance by one of the reviewers of my book. And this, I think, the reviewer of the book was referring to something actually written by Karl Popper, where he attacked soft liberals for not defending liberal values well enough, for tolerating intolerance. And Karl Popper says at some point you cannot tolerate intolerance. And you cannot, because people who are intolerant might well end up teaching their followers, and I quote Popper here, to answer arguments by the use of their fists or pistols. Now, the question is, when do you crack down on intolerance? When do you get tough? Do you do it before those fists are used or those pistols are fired, or after acts of violence? Now, in most European countries, we don't, or no European country do we have the equivalent of the First Amendment. Most European countries have laws against the incitement of violence or indeed racial or religious hatred. And in my view, one should never tolerate the use of violence or the threat of the use of violence to impose views. But I think views, just because they are intolerant, cannot so easily be cracked down upon by the state, or at least one has to be very skeptical of giving the state too much authority to police views before it can actually be proven that they will lead to active acts of violence. But I think underneath this debate, underlying this debate, is an old anti-liberal critique, which is you find it a lot in the interwar world in Europe, and you find it all over again today, which is a critique of liberal society, that liberal society doesn't really believe in anything, that liberal society is nihilistic, that it doesn't believe in anything beyond material prosperity. Heidegger, I think, coined the phrase comfortismus, that the bourgeois liberal thinks of nothing but his creature comforts. And there is almost, I think, in a lot of the so-called secularists, and by secularist I mean not just a description of a secular state of mind or a secular state in the sense of separating religious from political authority. I mean a dogma of secularism. There is among the secularists almost an envy of Islamists or indeed Muslim believers, that at least they have something to believe in, whereas we in the decadent liberal West no longer believe in anything. We can't defend ourselves. Hence, again, the attacks on multiculturalism or what people call cultural relativism. If everything is relative, then there's nothing to defend, which is, in my view, a misunderstanding of liberalism. It's true that the liberal state doesn't pretend to offer us the meaning of life, but it doesn't mean, tolerance doesn't mean that you don't believe in anything. You believe that people have the freedom to believe whatever they want, but not that they use or threaten to use violence to impose any views. The French idea of laïcité, of secularism, I suppose comes closest to a Western government, a Western state, imposing a certain norms and a certain cultural ideas that would be seen in Anglo-Saxon countries and also in the Netherlands as perhaps less than liberal, which is why in France the issue of wearing headscarves in public schools and so on has become such a burning one, whereas it doesn't really bother people very much outside France. But I think the important thing to bear in mind is that the challenge posed by Muslims in Europe is not a cultural or a civilizational one, or in the end a religious one. The challenge is how to accommodate communities, whether they're Muslims, Christians, Jews, or Sikhs, or any other group of believers who wish to assert their own norms and beliefs in public, without excluding them as democratic citizens. Forcing people to conform to norms set by the state, as is the tendency in France, is illiberal. But encouraging people to stick to their own ways, as has been the tendency in Britain, does not foster a sense of inclusion. The way forward, then, is not to insist on social, let alone theological conformity, but on the observance of the law. As long as people play by the rules of free speech, free expression, independent judiciaries, and free elections, they are democratic citizens, whatever they choose to wear on their heads. Now, this still leaves an open question, because what do you do when certain groups in liberal democratic society don't recognize the rules? Now here again, I think it depends on how they voice or express their dissent. There are groups in the United States, above all, religious groups, who've chosen to opt out of our society. The Amish, for example, who want to lead a life, preserve a culture, and so on, that is certainly not in step with liberal society, but they certainly don't use violence or threaten to use violence in order to impose their views on others. And so nobody really considers them to be a danger, nor do people consider the Hasidim in Williamsburg to be a great danger to society. After all, again, they are hardly paragons of modern liberal values, but they don't really threaten anybody else. Some evangelical Christian groups perhaps do, and when they do use violence, they are quite rightly seen as enemies of liberalism. Now, what do we do about the violent revolutionary Muslims? They must be isolated. I mean, of course, they must be cracked down on, and the police, intelligence, and so on must be used to minimize the damage. But they must also be isolated, and this can only be done if the majority of Muslim believers help to isolate them and feel that they are on the side of liberal society, which, after all, guarantees their freedoms as well as those of non-believers. Here, I think, the question is how to reconcile religious orthodoxy, belief in Islam or any other religious faith, with being a democratic citizen. And that, I think, is the question. And here an interesting figure, another controversial and iconic figure in the whole Kulturkampf going on in Europe at the moment, is Tariq Ramadan. Born in Switzerland, the son of Egyptian Islamists. His father was an important figure in the Muslim Brotherhood, as is his brother, and he himself is a highly controversial figure in France, now lives in Britain, but has an audience all over Europe, and is much hated by the secular. He's a real, perhaps one of the most hated figures amongst the secularists, in France in particular, but elsewhere. Now, why is he hated? Partly because he has said things about Israel and Zionism and so on, which come very close to anti-Semitism, but also because I think he makes a genuine effort, which has to be taken seriously, to reconcile religious orthodoxy with being a fully participating citizen of a European liberal democracy, which is why he has a wide audience amongst the educated sons and daughters of Muslim immigrants in Europe today, who are wrestling with this very question, something where an issue where somebody like an atheist, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, has less to contribute. This is not to say that there's no room for an atheist critique of religion or Islam, but she wouldn't be very persuasive to people who are trying to reconcile their lives as observant Muslims with being citizens of European democracies. He tries to reconcile the two in a way that's not unprecedented in history. There are Muslim thinkers who, in this tradition, but he's trying to find a way of balancing, on the one hand, Islamic orthodoxy, on the other hand, a rather old-fashioned third worldist leftism. But I think one should be critical of him, but he is to be taken seriously for this very reason, because I think he's trying to address a problem which has to be addressed. Now, to secularists, I think he is an enemy because they think he has to be acting. If you think that any kind of orthodox religion is by itself inimical to secular Western liberal democracy, then anybody who claims to build some kind of bridge between religion and democracy has to be acting out of bad faith, has to be speaking with a forked tongue, has to be telling one audience one thing and another audience another, which is the very thing he's often accused of. But I think in some ways he is not the problem, he is part of the solution. And I say that without agreeing particularly with his politics, and certainly having no great sympathy for his religious faith, which I do not share. Now, I think, to conclude, that Kulturkampf is the worst possible way to approach the tensions and the sense of crisis that exists in Europe today. Bismarck, who unleashed the Kulturkampf in the 19th century against the Catholics, failed in doing so. It was, in fact, a disaster, and later in Poland in particular led to extreme violence. But in the words of a Protestant theologian of his time, and I quote, "The state cannot conduct a war against a large part of its own population without causing, on all sides, profound injury to the moral consciousness." And I think that is true, is applicable to the way we deal with Muslims in Europe today. Now, of course, history doesn't ever repeat itself precisely, and the nations of contemporary Europe are not the same as those in Bismarck's Germany. But I think the human impulses towards violence, bigotry, and religious worship are more constant. Muslims in the West must be treated as fellow citizens, just as Catholics were in Protestant Europe. Europeans found a way to reconcile Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and non-believers by democratic means, but only after centuries of murder and oppression. It is in the interest of everyone, except the violent revolutionaries, of course, that Europe escapes from another round of religious violence. Tocqueville's idea that Islam and democracy cannot survive together must be disproven. This will be a test for Islam, but also for all the rest of us who will have to accept the believers of equals, even when we cannot possibly share their faith. Thank you very much. Now, this was a very general talk, so please force me to be more specific in your question. Yes.
I wonder, in this exceptionally wide-ranging talk, whether you wanted to include any reflections on Europe's or the European Union or the member states of the European Union's relations with Turkey. Because if there's one country where Islamic political movements seem to have made exactly the transition that you're hoping for, where many people make the analogy that they've done what the Catholic Church did in the 19th century, that they moved from a massive rejection of the modern world to the embrace of modernity in the form of Christian democracy, that people see Erdogan's motherland party as doing exactly this and offering a model of a kind that obviously isn't found in the North African states. Could you be hopeful if you look at Turkey?
Well, I think, as they say, the jury is probably still a little bit out. But I am inclined to be more optimistic than pessimistic. And I mentioned Indonesia and Malaysia. I should have mentioned Turkey. Because in some ways, I think that the Islamist government in power now is in some ways more democratic than the secular regimes were before. Now, there are many criteria that the Turks still have to meet before they can be accepted, I think, as a member of the European Union. And I think their human rights record and so on still has a lot of room for improvement. But personally, I think that the consequences of rejecting Turkey are much more risky and serious than the risks of allowing them to become a member of the European Union. And I think that the positive results of that could be considerable. And so I'm in favor of it in the long run. And I don't agree with some people I respect very much. For example, the German writer Hans Magnus Enzensberger, among others, have strong views that Europe would no longer be Europe if you allow the Turks in. But I don't see it that way. So, yes, I think in the long run we should welcome Europe into the EU.
What was the reason for the large number of Jews who were deported and killed from Holland, as opposed to other European countries?
Well, did everybody hear the question? I think that, there are several explanations. One is a geographical one, that Holland is very small and very flat. And so there are no mountains to hide. There are no remote rural areas. Jews in Holland were largely concentrated in Amsterdam and a few big cities. But perhaps the most important reason was Dutch naivete in some ways, in that Holland had, since the revolt against Spain in the 16th century, did not have a strongly developed anti-authoritarian tradition. It had been a largely law-abiding, quite bourgeois, very admirable society. But unlike France or Belgium, for example, where the instinct of the average citizen is if you could do that to the state, you did it, this was not the case in Holland. And so the Germans were very shrewd in the way that they operated, in that in the beginning the German occupation was relatively benign, and they would introduce little administrative measures that seemed small at the time. And because the Dutch, including the Dutch Jews, were so used to obeying authority and being law-abiding, they kept on thinking, well, if it's just mentioning your religion, it's okay, they'll leave us alone. If it's just wearing a star, well, maybe then they'll leave us alone. And the idea of being deported, being murdered, and so on, was so far from people's minds. They'd lived in such, let us say, emotional comfort, that it didn't occur to them to rebel. And then you had so the Jews did as they were told, and so did most non-Jews, including the Dutch bureaucracy, who actively collaborated with the German administration without necessarily being anti-Semitic or let alone murderous. And so in the end, it was fairly easy for the Germans to tighten the screws a little bit at a time until it was impossible to escape. And then there were, it must also be said, Holland was the only country where there was a general strike in Amsterdam against the deportation of Jews, the so-called February strike. It didn't do any good, but I think that is the main explanation for it. Maybe others here have other ones, but those are the two main explanations.
I wonder if you could say something about, sort of elaborate how we should think about tolerance and toleration as an aim, a goal, as a good thing, because I think it is, but I think it's complicated, and it's something that is arrived at through struggle, in a way. It's not easy. And I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit more about it.
The critics of tolerance rightly say that tolerance alone is not enough. Tolerance can become a form of indifference. Now, indifference may not be the worst thing. If the Germans had been indifferent about the Jews in the 1930s, the German Jews would be a lot better off. But it's not enough. Now, as I said, the other criticism is that it's a kind of nihilism. It means you don't really believe in anything, so you don't stand up for anything. And that, I think, often implies that the state should be more actively involved in imposing a certain kind of cultural and social conformity. And that if you want society to be harmonious, you cannot have different cultures existing in a society. People have to conform to a kind of general culture. And because otherwise there'll be disorder and trouble. Now, I don't really share that view, because I think that it is possible for people to stick to certain cultural traditions, as long as, and in this I'm following really the views of a scholar I do admire on this subject, Olivier Roy, where he says that it's a mistake to deal with the Muslim minority in Europe, the Muslim problem in Europe, in a theological way. What you should demand is not that they change their faith, and the state, which after all should be, in a secular state, should be neutral in theological affairs, should not be in the business of picking sides and saying, we'll deal with you because you're moderate, or we like the cut of your jib and we don't want those orthodox, and so on and so forth. What the state should insist on is that people play by the rules of democracy. And so as long as people abide by the law, you leave them alone as far as their cultural and religious habits are concerned. And I tend towards that kind of thinking myself. But that's not, of course, the orthodoxy in France, where people the people who believe strongly in the laicist state do think that the state should have a much stronger normative role.
Sid left a video, a posthumous video, in which he pretty much blamed it all on Iraq. I remember I found it particularly spooky because of those Yorkshire tones. It was extraordinary. It was so different from listening to Bin Laden or Zawahiri or one of these other people. If you kill our people, we will kill your people. And our people meant not the good folk of Leeds, but Muslims, my Muslim fellow religionists. How far do you buy this? That this is somehow Iraq and the Palestinian problem, or Chechnya or Kashmir, are to some extent anyway the driving forces behind all this?
Well, I don't think they're the driving forces, but I think that one of the most dangerous sources of communal aggression, whether it's Islamist or, let's say, Serbian, is a sense of communal grievance, of a historical wrong, of being the victims of history. And in that sense, I think the Palestinian issue and the war in Iraq have strengthened that feeling amongst Muslims in general, but Muslim radicals in particular, of a shared victimhood that has to be somehow avenged. And so I think that if it hadn't been Iraq, it probably would have been something else. But it adds fuel to that sense of grievance, which does not necessarily mean that the son of Bangladeshis in the north of England has a real affinity or feeling with Iraqis or Palestinians and might feel a total fish out of water if he actually went to these places. But in a sort of abstract way, it does fuel the sense of victimhood, and therefore, if you are inclined to the idea of needing to vent your rage in an act of vengeance, it makes things it makes things worse.
I was thinking when you were talking about, George Santayana's statement, if you don't remember the past, you're condemned to repeat it, and how much of what you were talking about and the conflicts that we've been hearing about have been religious in nature, and how religion is so introspective. But I'm also wondering if, as humans, if we consistently forget, you said we can't tolerate another several centuries of religious intolerance. Are we even capable as humans of being able to remember our past so that we're not condemned to repeat it? And is it possible for us, wanting so much to be part of a culture and these people being sort of fish out of water, if you will, kind of stranger in a strange land kind of people, is it possible that it's just due to the basic sense that our nature as humans, or I know I'm rambling, but I'm just kind of wondering about that, and that's the kind of stuff that was going through my head when you were talking.
Well, no, I think that there are many things in human nature that are potentially destructive, violent, and nasty, but we do our best in liberal societies to curb those tendencies. So they don't condemn us necessarily to catastrophe. Now, as far as the past is concerned, I think it's a very double-edged thing, because I'm not a great believer in the idea that if only we knew, we would learn more about the past, we will become better people. In other words, the more we know about Auschwitz or Hiroshima, the less likely we will be to repeat such things or repeat such things. I'm a bit pessimistic about that. I don't think it works that way. And on the contrary, sometimes we learn the wrong lessons of history. Partly, as I just said, this sense of grievance and vengeance in name of history. Partly simply because we learn the wrong lessons. I mean, one famous example is that one of the reasons why in World War II, the British, for example, opted to introduce the strategy of terror bombing large civilian areas of cities, was because they didn't want to repeat the kind of attritional trench warfare of World War I. And so one historical atrocity led to a new one, in a way. And I think there are many examples of that, which is not an argument against learning history. I mean, we should learn history, if only just to understand where we come from. I mean, it helps us. It helps understanding, but it doesn't help necessarily to curb what you were referring to earlier, the sort of human capacity for violence and destruction. That needs laws, institutions, and so forth.
Say something about could you say something about two things which are, I think, implicit in what you said, the Eurabia phenomenon, the use of that term?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you properly.
Yes. Could you say something about the Eurabia phenomenon?
Oh, Eurabia.
And another question, just because you come from the Netherlands, is the Geert, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Wilders phenomenon, his fitna video, which is all over the YouTube.
For those who don't know, Geert Wilders is the sort of Dutch equivalent of Jean-Marie Le Pen or Jörg Haider, except he only has one agenda, really, which is the idea of the Muslim threat and the immigration issue. And he made this very clumsy 10-minute, I think it's 10 minutes, video warning against all the dangers of Islam by splicing together images of extreme violence and arguing that it's all because of the Muslim faith and that the Quran is the modern version of Mein Kampf. Eurabia is one of those things, it's like Islamization that we are warned against. And the idea that Europe is being Islamized and very soon will be dominated by Muslims and will lose its sort of European identity and will all end up in a sort of Muslim authoritarian state. This notion is partly based on the assumption, which is a very traditional one, when people warn against the danger of unpopular minorities, that they're outbreeding us. They breed like mice. We don't produce enough children. Soon we'll be swamped. This is a very old image of horror. I think it's nonsense, partly because the Muslims are still a fairly small minority in Europe at large, and they'd have to breed awfully fast if they're going to become a majority anytime soon. And the other thing about it is that it assumes that third or fourth generation Muslims or people of Muslim origin will be exactly the same as the second generation, or possibly worse. I mean, more rigid, more dogmatic, more religious, which flies in the face of historical evidence on the whole, and unless the Europeans really get their economic policies and social policies horribly wrong and exclude minorities to such an extent that they'll become sort of a festering, impoverished minority in ghettos, which does not seem to be the case, in fact, despite the problems in French suburbs. I think what will happen is what has happened everywhere with minorities, that the more middle class they become, the more prosperous they become, the more they won't live in ghettos, the more secular they will be, and the more like all other citizens, integrated, in other words. And I think it's already happening. With all the Kulturkampf going on in newspaper pages and so on, in fact, a large number of Muslims are integrated European citizens. The mayor of Rotterdam was born in Morocco, and so it's not all bleak. And so I think it's one of these images that are designed to stir up hatred and antagonism, which is wrong-headed. And I'm always very suspicious. As soon as people talk about, in terms of that we have to wake up the people who are asleep and oblivious to the great danger facing them, those people are always to be distrusted. People who want to wake up the rest of the population. Erwachen, it's a word we've heard before.
We heard last week that in Germany the Green Party has now a German Turkish descent leader.
Yes, well, I think it's an example of the same thing. And Germany has been lagging behind countries like Holland and Britain. In Germany, more than anywhere, the definition of nationhood was for a long time very much a cultural and ethnic one. And if you were a third-generation Turkish writer, you would still be called a Turk. And the fact that the head of the Green Party is of Turkish origin is an extremely hopeful and positive sign, I think. That seems too hopeful a note to end this. Otherwise... Well, maybe we should end it there.